On an apparently ordinary night, something happened that would change your perception of how the people around you really see you. In a seemingly safe and relaxed environment, a group of people close to you gathered for a conversation that, at first glance, seemed casual. But what you didn't know was that your name, your behavior, and even your deepest feelings were being discussed. And what they said about you was something you would never have imagined. It all began with a casual meeting among friends and acquaintances. It was one of those nights when people get together without a specific reason other than seeking light conversation. As always, the atmosphere was pleasant. Laughter, old stories, and some updates on everyone's lives were part of the routine. But suddenly something shifted in the tone of the conversation. Something subtle yet impactful. The conversation took an unexpected turn. One of the group members, seemingly without meaning to, casually mentioned your name as if discussing something trivial. But the mere fact that you were brought up piqued the interest of others and caused them to view you from a different perspective. Every word, every sentence spoken carried an emotional weight that you could never have predicted. It's interesting how in moments of light-heartedness, people can reveal more than they might intend, especially when talking about someone they trust. And when that someone is you, the situation becomes even more delicate. What was said about you may not be what you expected, but it will undoubtedly change how you see yourself and how you view those around you. The first impressions that emerged weren't what you might have expected. A comment was made about your demeanor, so discreet and introverted. He has a unique sensitivity, someone said, but he never shows it, another added. This led people to start reflecting on just how much you really keep to yourself. Not that this was a negative thing, but the perception was that you have something inside you that no one truly knows. What followed was a constant flow of opinions, both complimentary and, in some ways, perplexing. Some mentioned how you have a unique way of handling complicated situations, but also how this tendency to remain silent can often be seen as distant or even inaccessible. The conversation seemed to move from one surprise to another, revealing layers that you never knew existed. One of the friends in the group, known for being more pragmatic and straightforward, said something that resonated with everyone. He carries more than he shows, but sometimes it seems like he doesn't even know how to let it go. It was as if you were a box of secrets, a riddle constantly evolving. But did you even realize it? That's when the tone of the conversation began to shift. The first moment of vulnerability surfaced when someone admitted that no matter how much you seemed to have everything under control, there was something profoundly sensitive about your nature. You were the type of person who, although strong in demeanor, silently carried your pains. And what was most striking was how this made them rethink how they acted around you. After all, who truly knows the internal struggles of another person? At this point in the conversation, there was a certain revelation, not only about you, but also about the group itself. How often did they judge your actions without realizing the complexity behind them? How likely was it that they had never stopped to consider the feelings you kept to yourself in silence? The reflection hung in the air like a thick, unpredictable cloud. But then the conversation took an unexpected turn. Someone mentioned how you, despite being reserved, were always present during the most important moments. Whenever someone needed help, there you were, listening, supporting, and being there. He never asks for anything, but he's always there for others, they said. This realization made some, for the first time, pause and consider just how much you truly dedicated yourself to those around you without expecting anything in return. This moment was significant. For many, it was a wake-up call. They had never stopped to think that while you stood in the shadows, perhaps by choice, you were also playing a vital role in everyone's lives. It was as if they finally saw the person beyond the stereotype, beyond the image of someone who stays quiet and observes. Perhaps, in reality, you were more than anyone had thought. And in a moment of deeper introspection, someone brought up the topic that no one seemed eager to address, how emotionally distant you were, or at least how it seemed. He seems so distant at times, one of the group members said, and as if a weight had been lifted from everyone, they began to question whether this distance was actually a reflection of something deeper. Could it be a defense against something, a manifestation of past wounds that had yet to heal? However, among the various opinions, there was one that echoed in everyone's mind. He's not distant. He just has a different way of connecting. Sometimes he speaks with his eyes. It was a simple phrase, but it stuck with everyone. And, unintentionally, it helped to understand that perhaps his ways of relating to others were more subtle and profound than they could have imagined. In that conversation, the deepest revelation was not about the mistakes you had made or the weaknesses you carried. It was about the qualities that were hidden, concealed under layers of behaviors that many until that moment had not noticed. It was about the recognition that you were, in fact, more complex, more intense, and more present than everyone thought. Now imagine going back to that group. How would you feel if you knew everything that was said? If you knew that around you there were people who until that moment couldn't see the person you really are, how would you react to these perceptions? And more importantly, how would this change the relationship between you? This is the type of reflection that lingers in everyone's mind when they discover that the perception they had of someone was far from reality. And perhaps the most important lesson is that sometimes people don't know who you really are until they shed their own prejudices and stereotypes. But how did you feel? Share your thoughts with us. The words still hung in the air, and the silence that followed seemed to reflect something deeper, something that everyone felt but no one had the courage to fully express. The conversation you never knew was happening about you began to reveal layers that perhaps even you hadn't noticed in yourself. It was as if, in some way, your own secrets and feelings were being exposed in a way that no longer belonged only to you, but to everyone. And as the discussion continued, something even more curious began to happen. The dynamics of the group started to shift. Those who were present began to look at each other differently. They were no longer just friends, acquaintances, or colleagues. Now they were people who had shared an intimate moment without even realizing it. What they said about you made them reflect on their own lives, behaviors, and attitudes. "Maybe we all are a little like him," someone said, breaking the silence. "Maybe we also hide more than we'd like to admit." It was a comment that cut through the conversation abruptly, but it was deeply necessary. Suddenly, the group was no longer just a collection of people observing your life, but individuals starting to see reflections of themselves in what was being discussed. The comments about your sensitivity, about how you carry everything alone, began to resonate differently. It wasn't just about you, it was about what everyone was doing with their own emotions. How people often prefer to hide what they truly feel to avoid exposing themselves. How the idea of always being okay, always in control, was in fact a reflection of fears and insecurities. And amidst all this, a simple yet profound realization emerged. Perhaps your way of dealing with life wasn't so unique after all. Maybe everyone around you was, in some way, grappling with their own silent and complex battles, just like you. Perhaps, deep down, they were all trying to find a way to live without being consumed by their greatest fears and weaknesses. It was a moment of unexpected connection that brought with it a new way of looking at everyone involved. The words and feelings shared were no longer just about you. They were about the humanity that connected each and every person present. And although the conversation had started out focused on you, it quickly transformed into a collective reflection on human relationships, the layers that everyone hides, and the ways in which we, often unconsciously, judge each other without truly knowing the truth behind appearances. Still, something in you was changing. As you heard those words, you felt strange, perhaps even vulnerable, but you also felt a sense of relief. Now the people around you were beginning to understand who you really were in a more genuine and complete way. No longer a distant enigma, but someone who carried a complex set of emotions and stories just like everyone else. And this, in some way, made the distance that had existed between you and the group start to diminish. You might wonder what would happen next. How would your relationship with these people change after they had been given access to a version of you that no one knew existed? Did you feel comfortable with this exposure? Or did you feel that in some way your privacy had been uncomfortably invaded? The truth was that now they knew more about you, but you had also learned more about them. Everyone had revealed themselves in some way, and there was no turning back. It was a moment of transformation, a turning point that could not be ignored. But more than that, it was an opportunity to reevaluate your relationship with the group and with each individual. How would this change the way you connected with them from that moment on? Would you have the courage to open up more, to show more of yourself? Or would you prefer to continue being the one who, no matter how close, always kept a safe distance? The group, in turn, felt equally transformed. What began as just another casual discussion turned into a turning point, not only for you, but for everyone present. They felt more aware of their own shortcomings, of the ways in which they might have projected misguided ideas about you. Those who once saw you in a specific light now began to perceive a complex human being, with pains and struggles that perhaps were much closer to them than they had imagined. And then, one last question hung in the air, unspoken but clearly felt by all. How is it possible, amidst all this, to keep things the way they were before? How can one return to normal when the truth has been told, when the layers have been peeled away and vulnerabilities exposed? The answer, inevitably, was that there was no going back. Something had changed, perhaps in perceptions, perhaps in connections, perhaps in expectations of how to relate to one another. From that moment on, everyone had the choice: to continue with the facade they had maintained for so long, or to allow themselves a bit more humanity. And you, what would your choice be? Time seemed to slow down as the weight of the conversation began to settle in each person. The group, once relaxed, now shared a dense silence, as if everyone were processing what had just been revealed. Each person there knew that something important had been said, something that would forever transform the dynamic among all. But deep down, there was also a sense that by exposing so much, they had allowed themselves to see beyond the surface, beyond the masks everyone wore. You in turn felt a whirlwind inside you. It wasn't the discomfort of being exposed, though that was inevitable, but the realization that perhaps you've lived your whole life with a veil over who you really were. And now, as you listened to all these comments, a new and strange feeling began to settle in. It wasn't shame, but a mix of confusion and maybe even relief. Relief in finally knowing that the people around you were starting to see you as you truly were, with all your complexities, contradictions, and unsaid feelings. But there was also a hint of sadness. After all, these perceptions, these conversations, would never have happened if you weren't the catalyst. It made you wonder, was there something in you that led everyone to such deep reflections? Or were they finally trying to understand themselves through someone whom, until that moment, they had only viewed from a distance? As the silence became more comfortable, some of those present began to break it. The speeches, once so objective and to the point, were now softer, laden with a new vulnerability. "I never imagined you were carrying all of this," one of them said, looking into your eyes with a sincerity that didn't seem false. "I didn't realize how much I was projecting onto you." This type of confession, in any other context, might have seemed forced or uncomfortable, but there in that moment it felt genuine. There was something about the revelation of everyone's feelings that had deeply touched them, and it was impossible to revert to the old way of relating. It was as if you, unintentionally, had provided an opportunity for everyone to open up, for the walls of safety to crumble. For some it was liberating, for others a challenge, but for all it was an invitation to reflect, to change, and perhaps to heal. The conversation began to stretch on, but it was no longer about you. It was about everyone, about what each person kept to themselves, about the parts of the soul that are never revealed, and about the deep desire to be understood and accepted. What was once a superficial exchange had transformed into a space of true connection. And amidst all of this, you began to understand, perhaps to be truly seen, it was necessary to expose yourself, even if that meant unsettling yourself first. Now, the biggest question was, could you go back to being who you were before? Or like everyone present, was there something new, a new way of being that had emerged from this unexpected conversation? Now reflect, how do you feel knowing what others think about you? Share.